Welcome back. We're taking another look at this 1913 Victrola VVXI. Back in August, actually August 2nd, I posted episode 112, which was part 3 of this series. And at the end of the episode, I mentioned that I couldn't get the spring barrel opened and that I was waiting for a company called Antique Phonograph Supply Company in Davenport, New York to reopen. And those were the people who made the springs, and they also installed them if you'd wish to send them your spring barrel. Well, they only operate in the fall, so August was the last time I was able to touch this project, and it's kind of just sat on the back burner until then, and actually until today. We actually got an email back at the beginning of the week from the company, and they said that they are now back in the shop making springs. And let me know what size you need and whether or not you have the hook end or the loop end. And I mentioned, well, I still can't get this apart. Can I please just send this to you? They said, absolutely. And there was some instructions on their website how to pack the box. So I gathered some supplies. We have some newspaper, some bubble wrap. I have a roll of tape on a dispenser just to make things easier. And of course we have a couple boxes. In here there's actually a second box and some packing peanuts, so we're going to really pack this up really well. The idea is we're going to take the newspaper and we're going to wrap that up first, and we're going to kind of just build layer after layer, and then I'll probably wrap it with the bubble wrap and so on and so forth. And the inner box is a 6x6x6 box, like a cube, so this should fit nicely. I'm going to try to make it as tight as possible within the inner box. So if the inner box rattles around inside of these peanuts, it's not going to be a big deal because the inner box is going to be packed so tightly. Any forces, I guess you could say, should be taken up by the peanuts and everything, and that's the idea. So I'm going to go ahead and just do that really quick, and when I come back I'll show you what we came up with. Obviously you can see we got a lot of room in this box. I'm just going to take a bunch of paper like this and more or less just put the spring barrel at one end of it and just roll it. You want to be careful with the gears that are on this so you don't bend them or anything like that. So I'm just going to go ahead and put some tape across there. I'll probably just neaten this up a little bit like that. And then of course you want to like scrunch the ends in on both sides over here. I'm just going to wrap the heck out of this in tape. And here's the first wrapping. You can see there's plenty of padding at both ends over here where the shafts stick out, and that's important to keep it from bending. I'm going to continue putting some more tape on here just to keep this all really tight, and there's definitely some room left in the box, so I'll most likely just continue packing it. Maybe we'll do a couple wraps of bubble wrap first and maybe put paper on top of it as a secondary layer. Maybe I'll put the paper first. We'll figure it out. All right, that's the second set of newspaper on top of it. That's definitely a lot better. Still should be some room in the box here, hopefully. I can always catty corner it. The inner box isn't as important as the outer box, obviously, but I definitely want to have some kind of cushioning. All right, so I'm going to have to squeeze this in here to get this into here. We'll start with some bubble wrap in the bottom of the box. Yeah, it fits pretty good, so I'll take the remaining bubble wrap and just pack it along the sides and here along the top, so this is a solid object. I got a couple pieces up on top. Now we'll just take this, close it up nice and tight, and that's definitely solid. And when I do that, I'll tape it along the sides here as well as across the seam on both sides. I usually do 2 strips across the seam just to really make sure this is nice and tight. Now that that's all taped up, we'll give it the rattle test. You should be able to shake it all around and not hear anything move at all. And there should be no rattling or anything like that, which is exactly what we have here. I got some bubble wrap left over, so maybe it wouldn't hurt just to give it another coating on top. The more the merrier. That's yeah, I'm pretty confident about that. So now it's a matter of getting it into the box with the peanuts. Easiest way to do this is just to take the peanuts out of this box, obviously, and put them into something else so I can dump them all around, but I'll have a layer down at the bottom first that this will sit into. And there we have it. Now it looks like it's a little tight in there, and frankly it is, but that's okay because when you go to push these flaps down, that's going to put some tension on here, I guess you could say. And these will all compact down anyway, and you do want a little bit of a layer between the outside edge. Even though there's a couple layers of bubble wrap, because this is the edge where they all folded over, like I kind of gift wrapped it. And by the way, the gloves, I had these on when I started this because the spring barrel is covered in all kinds of old grease. Hopefully they'll clean that. I'd imagine they would. If not, maybe I'll make mention of it in the email I send them. Of course, they'll get an email with the tracking number to let them know this actually went out with of course, the tracking number. And I'll also include some kind of correspondence with this, with just my name and address, and you know, what model number, I guess you could say, that this belongs to, and everything else. So I'll do that before I close the box. But I'll type that letter up, I'll stick that in here, I'll get the label stuck to this obviously and get it sent out, and the next time we come back to this particular subject, I'll have this back in my hands. So that'll be just 2 seconds for you, and who knows how long for me. Like I said, it was a couple seconds for you guys, it was a couple weeks for me. It's now December 11th, it's Sunday. I received the box of the parts in on Friday, just haven't had a chance to work on it until today, obviously. But what I did want to show you guys, in the interim, while I was actually waiting for this project to be worked on, I received some parts from somebody else I'm actually doing a project for. If you go back to my other videos and you look at the Row R85 jukebox repair, I may or may not have mentioned that the owner of that came across these Victrola parts at a flea market. He was actually picking up records for his jukebox, and someone said, hey, these belong with those records you just bought. And he went, this is like old stuff, I don't need this. Like, no, it's included. So he took it and then remembered our conversation about this project here, and he said, you know, you might want to take these parts, they may actually come in handy for you. And they kind of just been sitting in the box, just actually in the back of my van for the longest time, just taking rides with me everywhere. And now I got all the parts over here in, I said, let me take a look at these other pieces just to see, just in case there's something here that I need. And well, it's a good thing I did, because at first I couldn't find the screws that attach the motor to the base plate. And turns out they're actually sitting inside of the phonograph. I left everything inside of there so I wouldn't lose it. So fortunately I did find that. But if I switch over to here and show you the sound tube, you'll notice that there's this peg sitting on here with this little support. Now, I'm not sure exactly which model of Victrola this is from. This is newer though than what I have, and I'm just basing that upon the top side of it, which I will turn this over in a minute. It is really greasy, so I have my gloves on, and you know, have to be careful in my clean indoor work environment. If I was out in the shed, it wouldn't be a big deal, but it is December and it's freezing cold out, so alas, here we are. But we could see in this tone arm here that there is actually an additional little bracket here that's not on mine. But the important thing here is this top piece up here, this part that unscrews. The one I'm working on is actually missing that piece. I have everything else. So I will actually be taking that piece off of here. The other thing, which we'll get into once I get to it, is the governor. There's 3 springs on the governor with a counterweight on it. And at one point the counterweight, one of them was replaced, and that new counterweight is actually a different mass than the other 2. So it actually it spins off centered. So I will most likely be either grabbing one of the counterweights off of this governor, or I'm going to modify the one that I took off the other turntable. Now, what I did was I took some of the empty bins that I had, and I actually organized these extra parts. These are all the old needles, both the ones that were in the box from these parts and also inside of the old phonograph that I'm working on. And you may be able to see, if you have a keen enough eye, there are actually 2 different sizes in here. There's a thicker one and a thinner one. And I'm not 100% sure, but I think one's considered hard and one's considered soft. I'm assuming the thinner ones are the soft and the larger ones are the heavy. But I did order new needles. That's actually sitting in the box. We'll get to that. And there was also some random screws and fasteners and stuff like that. So I'll definitely be saving that. I don't intend on ripping this whole motor down now. I don't need everything out of it, but I did want to show, if I do turn this over, it has actually been wound up, and if you give it a little go, it will actually start to release the tension in the spring, and we can get an idea of how this operates. You see, this is the governor that I was talking about, and it does have 3 good counterweights on it. But I have to tip this just right because the end of the platter sits right at the end of this wood. So if you tip it forward a little bit, it actually shuts off because it hits my desk. But yeah, I could tell this is a newer piece by how compact the motor actually is. You can see here's the main gear over here, and everything over here lines up directly. So this is actually the main worm gear for the spindle. If you follow this out, it goes all the way to the other side of the platter, and this governor kind of spins up against the bottom half of it. So the other one, mine, is very similar in how it actually works. The difference is the angle that everything's at. The actual worm gear is different, and for all intent and purpose, the whole governor assembly here might be actually different. But if we could just observe this for a little bit, we could see it does spin pretty good. It gets a little faster, but it's not a perfect set of gears here, that's for sure. This definitely does need to be cleaned up. I'm not going to put any real effort into it. This is just going to be for parts. If anything, I might end up giving some of this to the owner because he might be able to use this in the future. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and just clean these parts off my desk, and we'll get the box of the newer parts into view here, and we'll see what it looks like. Now, of course, I had to have a little bit of a sneak peek inside this box because, after all, it did come Friday, and I got to it late Friday night, but curiosity was killing me. This is not the same box I sent it to him in, which I expected, but it is about the same size. And they did the same double packing that I did here, which was smart. Now, there's some parts in here. Now, this is your bearing oil and your screw oil. And they gave me a pencil, and they said this isn't for an application. I'm not exactly sure how to use a pencil to apply oil. I'm thinking just dip it in there, but I will hopefully find something on that. Further down in here, there's actually these are your needles. There are 2 packets in there. Like I said, one's hard, one's soft. There's 100 in there of each. I'll put those to the side so they stay nice and neat. Everything else in here is just peanuts. Assuming most of these are the same as I sent them, but there's actually a smell to this. It's very hard to describe, but anybody who's worked with any kind of mechanics, it smells like gear lube. It smells like really fine oil. It's kind of got a clean smell to it, if that makes any sense. It doesn't have that used grotesque smell to it like a lot of older parts do, but it does have a scent nonetheless. But this is one of those, like I said, it's a good scent. And in here, wrapped nicely, is our spring barrel with 2 brand new springs in it, and I had them clean it. It's definitely a lot better than it was. I noticed it right away when it came out of the bag. I'm like, oh, that's nice and clean. This was, I don't want to say tarnished, but it definitely had some kind of a surface funk to it. Maybe it was just old gear lube or whatever it was, but you can see once again they spin like they're supposed to. This one's attached to the spindle on this side, this one's not. Just really briefly looking at this spring barrel versus the other one that I just had on camera here, you can see this is definitely different, where the gears sit, where the little ratcheting end here sits. But I'm really excited to get this in. It should be worth noting that when they had this packed, they actually had a piece of cardboard stuck in here between these 2 springs to kind of keep them from wobbling about. But so far so good. I'm really happy with the job they did on this. I do have my Brasso with me. Perhaps I'll just give this a quick polish job like I did everything else. So we'll put that to the side. This is all just, as you can expect, it's just packing material, nothing here. I do tend to like getting packing materials from someplace else. However, seeing Goshen on here, I have a feeling this is the paper I originally wrapped everything in. Considering Davenport Center is quite a ways away from where we are. I mean, obviously we're still all in New York, but they're much more north than I am here. Speaking of parts too, everything I have over here in the corner was actually put out in the shed, and my shed is not a very good environment, I'll be honest with you. It's very damp, musty, and yeah, it's got to get replaced. But the thing is all these parts stayed out here, and they stayed nice because I had them all in these lidded containers. And just to refresh everyone, you know, some of these gears in here, this is what I said that I went and polished, and they don't look perfect. I mean, they're well worn, but they certainly look a heck of a lot better than they did when I first started. See, this is the turntable spindle. The turntable actually attaches right to this, just slides over. The other one, the other spring barrel that I have here, has a much different design. Same concept, just a different design. But all these things, they all stayed really good. I was concerned that maybe they just would have gotten a little bit of corrosion on them from being out in that damp environment, but they did not, luckily. I'll open this up and just show you. Here's one of those polished brass gears. So we'll do the same job with that other one. Here is that counterweight that we want to try to reuse. You see, this one has a screw hole in the back of it, so we can just screw it into the spring. In fact, here's that piece of that broken spring. You see, it's just snapped right in half. Now, here's the motor mounting plate. This one wasn't in any kind of protection, although I had cloths on top of it just to keep any vermin and stuff from messing with it. But yeah, it's really nice. It stayed really good. I'm happy with that. There's nothing really to mess with on this particular board. And then the last thing I have here is the governor, and I'll show you a good close-up of that. Yeah. So that's the counterweight that's got to get replaced. If you spin this in your hand, you know, I actually had just roughly put some of this back together the other night, just in anticipation to kind of remember where everything went. And you could just see when this thing was spinning, it was just not spinning right. Unfortunately, there's no screw in the back of this like the other two have. This one's actually permanently attached. So my thought process was maybe I could just take the Dremel and just whack the back of this off, remove it, and then just screw the new one in. I don't know how large the hole is in the spring though, and that's going to be the only problem with that. But I do have the other governor that I can always use the parts from, and they do seem like they are the same for this part. The spring, actually the gear part itself may be a little different because of the pitch. This one sits kind of straight on, the other one sits kind of on an angle. So that may be the only difference, but I won't know that until I actually get into it. But all in all, I'm really happy with the way these parts kind of went. The other thing I'll show, there's these set screws that sit into these collars, and there's different places these collars are used. Well, one of those collars sat at the end of the crank, and it was missing the screw, which meant the crank could be slid in and out, which may or may not engage the gears, which is a bad thing because you could strip the gears out. So I actually found a computer case screw fits perfectly into the threads. So I'm going to go ahead and use that. Of course, it's not original, but I'm not going to find an original one like this, unless of course the one on my parts turntable are the same. I will look at that though. Only thing about using that other turntable is the parts are filthy. I do have everything here to do a cleaning. I just didn't want to do that in the house. You may recall we did that outside last time back. It was over the summer now already. But you know, being organized is half this battle here. Just keeping all the parts neat and organized where they belong is definitely going to save us some time here. And along every step of the way here, I'm going to have to clean my desk down because, you know, this is where I do my electronics work. I don't have my anti-static mat here. I've removed that just to give me a cleaner surface to work with here. But and you can see up here, by the way, is all the old hardware to reattach everything together. And some of this stuff isn't universal, and the reason why it's not is because they changed the design throughout the course of the life of this particular turntable, and a lot of the stuff is hand machined. You could just look at the screws and tell somebody either handmade these or it was made on such a low production run that they only used what they needed. And next, let's say the following year, 1914, whatever, they decided to change the design of something, then that meant that they had to change all the bolts and change everything as well. So the progression of this thing throughout time you might find it harder and harder to match parts up. It's not like a car, you know, it's not like 99 to 2004 was the same model year and you can use parts in between them. You know, there may be one or two parts that are different, but the rest are the same. This, you could have 2 different years and the parts are completely different. So that's definitely something to watch out for if you tend on, you know, using parts from one machine to work on another. But luckily we have all the parts we need just about to get this working, minus 1 or 2 pieces. So I think what I'm going to do first is I'm going to break out that Brasso, and I'm just going to go ahead and just give this a quick polish job just to make that nice and clean. And of course we're using my old can from probably 17 years ago when I bought it. Now I already mentioned how to apply Brasso in one of the other parts of this particular build, but it's very much like doing car polish. You're just going to put it on and just work it in a little bit and go all around whatever it is that you're polishing, and then when you're done, after it sets in for a minute and the actual you know, active material, whatever you want to call it, flashes off and you're left with this haze, you can buff it off. And just rubbing that on, you can see it starts to take off stuff pretty immediately. Of course this smells, so you want to have some kind of ventilation or not, if you don't mind the scent, but I would strongly suggest opening up some kind of a window or whatever. But I'm just going to go ahead and just do that to this really quick and see what we come up with. All right, it's not perfect, but it certainly is a lot better than it was originally, and certainly a lot better than it looked when I sent it out to them. So between their cleaning and this quick little polishing, it looks pretty good. Keep in mind this isn't a piece you're going to see normally, and it's also going to have oil on here, so it will get dirty, but I figured why not start clean. So that's that. It wasn't too bad, but then again, you know, it was pretty bad, I guess, because there was enough stuff that came off on the towels. You can see it turning black. So now I'm going to go ahead and just line up all the parts here. We're going to start assembling this thing. Before I do that though, let me take a look at the old governor. And yeah, just looking at this, we can see they are a little bit different. That gear up at the end here is different than what's on here. This brass wheel at the end is dead identical from what I can tell, and the counterweights also look really identical. I hope you guys can pick that up. But anyway, there's one set screw up here that holds this collar in place, and this collar I'm assuming has the ball bearing in the end of it like ours does over here. But the other end of it over here doesn't actually seem like, or actually I take it back, it's really greasy in here so it's hard to see, but there is a set screw in here as well. Now on my turntable here, if I undo these 2 set screws, I can pull these out and then you just pull this governor straight up. This one seems though that everything on here is so greasy and old, it's the best way to describe it, that it's not actually going to come off on us. And yeah, this is that same brass gear in here. You can see it's just really crusty with old grease, and same thing with the spring barrel. It's pretty gross. I will not mention, it's not important, but the horn that sits underneath this that amplifies the sound out, this particular model's horn has a raised tray around it, almost to catch the grease that may drip off this, whereas the one I'm working on does not have that. That's another indication that that's a newer model. Also, I'll put this into view. Over here, this is where the crank actually attaches to the main barrel assembly over here. And if we observe that, you'll notice that there isn't actually one of those little collars over here. This is definitely a lot different. I initially thought maybe I could just take these springs out, just the whole barrel, and put it into the one I'm working on. But since there are so many differences, I decided against that. And just for comparison, I'll bring the base plate in. So this post here and this post here is where the governor sits. And then the hole here is where the actual shaft comes up. And then here and here are where the uprights come to hold the spring barrel. So that sits over here. So you can just see by comparison, this is definitely a lot larger of a platform, even though it has the same size spring barrel. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And just to show, I'll just give this a little crank here. And you can kind of see how this works. If I turn it around over this way, there's the cog with the little stop on it, and that's what keeps that from spinning back in the opposite direction. And if you actually just lift this whole thing up, you can see everything start to spin. And that noise you're hearing, that's just the platter or something hitting on the other side, probably one of the braking mechanisms. But that's really it. I mean, that's how it works. So this is what we're going to shoot for here. This is the kind of motion that we want. In fact, it may be even a little bit of better motion once everything's properly lubricated. So now the thing is deciding whether or not I want to use one of these actual old counterweights and springs off of this old governor here, if I just want to modify the other one over here. I'm leaning towards modifying it because I know this is a working unit. I mean, obviously I know this works too, but I have to do a lot of work to this. I have to degrease it and everything else, and that's the one step I didn't want to do if I didn't have to. I decided for simplicity to just remove one of the springs. I'm a little hesitant to use a Dremel tool on such a small thing, so I said, let's just do it the right way, and I'll just remove one of the springs from the older one. We can see it is the exact same size. Everything should be right. I'm just going to go ahead and clean this up real quick with some of that degreaser. I decided to just use the metal spring and take everything else off. I did have the counterweight as part of this, but after I cleaned it and everything else, which is this one here, yeah, it's a lot better than it was, but I had to do some light sanding on it to get some of that heavy grease off of it. And I said, you know, I'm not going to waste too much time on that because I already have one that I cleaned from earlier, and this is the one that actually belongs with this set. So what I'll do is I'll just use this spring, I'll reattach everything to it, and then just replace this one with it. No harm, no foul. And then if anything, I could always use the spring from this eventually at some point if I decide to Dremel this off. If I get a chance to do the outside, then I can obviously rebuild the governor that I had with the other one. I may still end up disassembling that other unit and just cleaning all the parts off and perhaps just selling the pieces. I haven't really figured out what I'm going to do with that as a whole yet, but for the meantime I am going to use whatever pieces I can off of it. So let me go ahead and actually assemble this. I'd say that's a lot better. At least it seems more balanced now. You can tell it just by spinning it here in your hand. It's not wobbling around, which is excellent. Okay, now it's time to actually assemble everything. Let's point out the little diagram that's on the bottom side of the motor mount here. This little metal plate you can see in the bottom is where the motor attaches from the back side, and then this wood surround is what holds this into the actual phonograph cabinet. But luckily this little diagram here is in perfect condition. This actually points out where you're going to actually use Vaseline compared to using oil. And you can actually see in the background over here, there's our two oils, and I have a container of Vaseline. That's just the, you know, regular dollar store brand Vaseline. I have that around just for purposes like this, but if we take a look here, it tells you to lubricate worm with pure Vaseline. That's the worm gear here, which connects between the spring barrel and the actual platter. They also mention using Vaseline on the worm gear connection over here, and they mention using oil on the bearings, and this is the back and the front bearing where the governor actually sits into. There's a little leather pad, that's the friction pad that actually slows down the governor here. They recommend using some oil on that. And the shaft bearings, there's pretty much bearings all throughout this device. So on anywhere where there's a bearing, we're going to use bearing oil. The lead screw oil they recommend using in places where it's a brass and a steel gear meshed against each other. The bearing oil they recommend using one that's steel on steel, and obviously we'll just pack the worms with some of this stuff here. It does also say you could use the lead screw oil on the top half of the phonograph for little things like around the tone arm and just the various places where you do need some kind of lubricity. And it does, I went on their website, it doesn't say anything about this pencil. I'm assuming we're just going to dip this in. That's the only best way I can think about it. Pencils also have graphite. Graphite is used as a lubricant. Now, if I did actually replace the spring barrel assembly, like the springs inside of here, you would actually mix flake graphite with this Vaseline, and you would make bearing grease out of it, and that grease is what you would use inside here. And I'm assuming that's what they pack this with. They have to pack it with something, so it's most likely that. And you know, Vaseline was actually what was originally used on this. That's why it's all gummed up inside there. But what we'll do now is, as we're assembling this, we're going to use those different fluids and compounds in the various areas over here. So if we look in here real quick, this is where the actual bearing will mount into, and then these screws hold it in place. Here's that little friction pad. There's some bearing elements in here and in here. Like, all those things are going to get hit up and cleaned, because you're here, you might as well do it. I'm also going to use that lead screw oil to help assemble this. So places over here where these little metal studs stick up, and then this support has to slide into there, I'm just going to put a little tiny bit in here just to facilitate getting this together. Also, any surfaces like in here and here where this gear gets sent through, those will all have bearing grease on it. I mean, you can see it spins pretty good now, but we want to have the least amount of friction there as possible. Also, things like this little cog over here, all that will get lubed. First thing I want to do is actually, I'm going to put this governor in. I made a note that the outside sleeve has the keying on it. And so if you look, here's the outside sleeve. You can see there's this little line cut into it where the inside sleeve does not have that. Also, make sure your ball bearings are still in the ends here, which they are. That's an important step to remember. Now, these are going to set, basically the inside one here is going to, the outside one over here is going to be slid in, and we're going to slowly adjust this set screw up on the top here until it actually engages. Oop. And once that does, we know where it's going to sit. It's going to only sit in one place, so we'll just keep tightening that down here until we get that locked in. And this one will be considered non-adjustable once we get that sweet spot, which is probably right around there. The other one is going to be adjustable. We'll be able to slide this in and out to get the proper tension on this actual spindle here. And you're also going to want to go ahead and put a drop or two of that bearing oil in here at this point. Now, the bearing is going to get put in over here first, so this little shaft here will go into here, and then we'll bring the other one in and then lower this down into position to engage this shaft here. And also we'll use some of that bearing oil on this little leather pad here, and maybe put a couple drops of the other stuff on the end over here just to lubricate that up. We can see the slightest little movement here makes this thing spin really easily. In fact, if you give it a good flick, works pretty good, and that's what you want to see. And it's almost like perpetual, just wants to keep going. I mean, obviously it's going to slow down, but this is a lot better than it was with that odd counterweight. I mean, there's a little tiny bit of wobble to this, but it was bad before. Like, it really was noticeable. But I just put some of that oil in here, and in the end I lubricated that pad like I mentioned. That pad, by the way, that's a speed regulator. It also works as a brake, but at a certain point you can adjust the speed on this, and it puts the slightest amount of friction on us to slow this down. So far, so good. The next thing we're going to do is to actually mount the posts over here in the corner. This will be the back plate that the spring barrel will connect into. Now, taking a look at this back plate, there's actually an adjustable sleeve inside of here, and there's a screw on here that pinches this together to hold this, but there's also another screw over here that adjusts the depth. I didn't touch this. I left this exactly where it was when I took it out, because it's going to be a lot easier to reset this up. But of course, that face inside there is going to get a good helping of bearing oil, and then this will just sit on top here, and then these two screws will screw in from the bottom, hold it in place. Now, I need to use some kind of a platform to raise this up, because while this was sitting flush on the desk, once I put this shaft in, this is going to protrude from the other side of it, and it won't sit flush. So I do need something to clear that. But this shaft here is actually going to pass up through the bottom. Of course, that surface will have some bearing oil put onto it. But this is going to come up through here, and we'll have to slip down this collar, which is going to go in the bottom here, and again, get oiled up on this face. And then we'll have to slip this gear in. Now, this gear has a set screw. The set screw sits on the top, and that set screw and that gear and everything meshes up against this worm gear. So of course we'll also pack that with some of the Vaseline. Also worth mentioning, there is a little dimple right here on the main shaft that this set screw will sit into. So that's going to be where you key this into. It's very important to notice. So that's going to keep any slop on the shaft out, because it's been kind of set from the factory where that belongs. This top gear here is going to mesh with this worm gear, so we're going to adjust that. There was an actual spot on here, you may not see in the camera, but there's a line that was kind of dug in here by the set screw, and I actually put this shaft into my drill press to spin it, and using a piece of sandpaper, and in places even a file, I managed to cut that ridge out. I mean, that ridge was there from just this being set. It's not a natural ridge. It's not a place like this one is down here where it's supposed to sit. So I had to kind of relocate where that's going to fit. And by the way, to make sure you do have this right, these gears are actually slanted, and that slanting is what mates up against this worm gear. So you have to make sure that slanting is right. If you notice that this isn't lining up properly, then you'll have to flip this over the correct orientation. This is essentially what we're looking for right here. You can see that those two made up pretty nicely. Hopefully I can get close enough in here to show you that. If I tip it just the right angle, you'll see they are mated nicely. Now this is dry, there's no lube on here. Also, the set screw has not been put into place. But that's what we're looking for. We're looking for a good mesh between those gears. Any further down and it will bottom out, basically. Now, the way worm gears go, you can turn this both ways. You can see that. If you actually engage that slop, it's not going to connect. But that plate does go down this way, and there's actually a ball bearing that sits up on the top here with a screw that holds this into place on up here. So we'll make sure we have all that properly aligned, but just giving this preliminary test, so far it looks really good. Also, you can see I'm getting pretty greasy here, but that's why I am wearing these gloves. But to put some Vaseline on here and maybe put some of that lead screw oil on this brass face here is probably going to be ideal. And as we can see, that lubricated nicely and is spinning very freely. And the thing about lubrication is it doesn't only help things move freer, but in some situations it helps things move slower, and that just has to do with the viscosity of the oil. You know, friction, it's all it comes down to. But if we just look at this whole assembly here, we can see everything is lubed up nicely, from the actual retaining shaft down here to the retaining piece to the shaft itself, where it holds into. You can see the ends of this worm gear have a little bit of the excess petroleum jelly on there, but everything does spin nicely. So of course the natural progression is to move on to the rest of this here, which of course would be the spring barrel. And the way that spring barrel is going to go, we're actually going to put the back end in over here, which is this end. This thing, I forgot how heavy this is. So that's going to slide in over here like this, and then this gear is going to actually mate up against that shaft, and at the same time we're going to have to put that front support in, which will also engage this shaft as well. And it's all going to kind of, once that goes in, it's all going to kind of go together really quickly. And also, before we go too much further, I'm going to have to slide this shaft into here with this gear on the end of it, because this is going to come in from this side, and this is actually going to match up against this other gear here. And these are those faces that will get the bearing oil as well. And as you can see, we have everything mounted in place. We still have to put the little retaining ring on here to keep this from moving in and out. And also we'll have to put the ball bearing up at the very top here with the screw to hold that into place. But so far it's coming along just the way we want it to. I did actually have to undo the screws back here on this plate and kind of give some, I guess you could say, I loosened the screw up over here too, just to give this a little bit of movement, and trying to get this all together, get this gear engaged by moving the shaft, and then also this worm gear, getting this to line up and everything. Just took a little trial and error, but eventually it did go in just the way I want. So I'm going to go ahead and put some bearing oil down in here, put that ball bearing and the screw into place, get that collar put on the way that's supposed to be, and then we can go ahead and play with this a little bit, give it any kind of adjustment that needs to be adjusted. We'll also see, you know, where else I need to put some stuff, like I'll need to put some Vaseline in here and get that all lubed up as well. I should also point out, if you come across one of these little washers like this, that washer actually does go on top of here, and it just provides a surface, a friction surface for that collar to attach to. I put some Vaseline on the lead screw there. I didn't do anything else lube wise on that gear, but I did want to actually attach the crank here and see what we can find, and hopefully this will do what we want it to. Now we can see the outside barrel is spinning. You can see hopefully in here the gear is turning. It's engaging on the center gear, which is the one that's turning that outside spring barrel. So far, so good. If I stop spinning, nothing happens here. Oh. Now that chattering there, see now the outside one's spinning. That chatter is an indicator that this gear isn't quite in the spot where it needs to be. So I'm actually gonna stop that from spinning to avoid any damage, and I'll take this set screw back out, and I'm just going to lightly tap this into place. I'm just looking around right now, see what materials I have. I don't want to hit this directly with anything metal because it's going to ding it up, so I'll have to put some kind of wood or something on here. I do have a brass punch that's out in the shed, of course, but I'll have to put something onto this to actually tap that into place just to mesh those gears a little bit better. Oh, that's a lot better. I just took the end of the screwdriver here, which is plastic, and it's not going to hurt the metal here, and just tapped it into place, and that's the result we want. That's a nice smooth operation. I'll just zoom on that for a second to show you what I'm talking about. You know, you can almost hear it. It sounds like a purring kitten. That's exactly what you want. Definitely good fluid motion here. You can see that governor is just spinning a million miles an hour here. If we apply a little bit of pressure here to this arm, you can see the bottom of the screen, there's that little felt pad pushing up against it, which is causing that ring to move outward. We can actually break it completely. But that's what we want. In fact, if you actually look, you can see that the gear's lower down into position, and if you look, if you figure the side of my hand is the side of this gear here, you want them to sit parallel with each other. You don't want one too high or one too low, because it's not going to engage the gear right. You want it to mesh just right, and that's the situation we got. But looking at this one now, comparing it to that other one, you can definitely see how much more compact this one is. All they basically did was just reorient the way the spring barrel and everything sits around this central shaft here. But it's interesting how this little shaft over here turns one gear, which causes the one spring to turn, and then tension from that spring winding causes the outside one to wind, and then that moves this outer gear here, which moves this worm gear and turns the platter. But to keep it at a constant speed, that same gear also turns another worm gear, which of course has these weights and springs on the end of it. So it's pretty interesting how they did this, and I didn't think that a couple cranks would make this thing run for so long, but it does, which is just remarkable. It just goes to show you, back in the day when things didn't have computers and electronics in it, and they actually had to use mechanics to get the same result, it's pretty cool how they actually did that. So what's left on this side of the board is just to do some final touches, just lubricate the rest of these gears, make sure there's plenty of Vaseline on this guy here, and that's pretty much it. And I'm going to attach this to the actual bottom of the motor mount. We'll get it into place. I do have an old record here that we'll throw on and try it out. Alright, got everything adjusted, lubed, perfect. This is just the way I want it to be. So I'm going to show a couple operations on this crank, and we'll start to see, you'll get to a point where the governor and everything is going to start spinning on its own, because there is actually enough tension on this inner spring here. That's it. It spins just the way I want it to. Once I put the platter on everything, we'll fully test it, but everything here is right where it should be. I mean, looks brand new. I mean, considering how it looked to begin with, if you go back to the earlier videos when we saw this, it was very crusty and just that grease all hardened up and everything on it. But this is a nice smooth operating motor right here for sure. Like I said, it sounds like a purring kitten. And that oil and everything worked out perfectly. So a final assembly is in order. Take a look at this motor mounting plate really quick. This is the speed indicator dial over here. This is the braking mechanism. There is actually an automatic brake. I still have not found the spring. My donor turntable has the same bracket, it looks like. This is spun inwards again like this one originally was when I picked it up. But that doesn't have the spring either, so this automatic thing isn't going to necessarily work the way we want it to, which it is what it is. I'm going to put some of that oil, one of the two oils, on this pad over here. I think it was the bearing oil that I used on the pad, and I might quickly remove this just to clean this up since I did everything else, the crank and whatnot. And before I go any further with putting this into the actual phonograph, I actually have to mount that little standoff onto the end of that tone arm that I initially mentioned. All right, there we go. Everything's mounted the way we want. The last thing I can do on this side, lube-wise, is just put a little bit of that light gear oil around this face here. This is the actual speed control, and I'll just zoom in on that, show you the operation of that quickly. You can see it's kind of like a ramp, and as you turn it this way, that rod goes up more and more and more, and then it gets to the point where it resets back to 0 and then it locks back down. And you can go both ways, but that's really meant to go this way. Also, you can see how that rod goes out and it engages the little pad at the end there, which will rub up against that brass disc. The reason why it's not right now is because this isn't in operation, but when it is, the weights over here and the springs or whatnot, they want to spin outwards, which causes us to pull in, and then it hits against that pad. So that's how you adjust the speed. Now there is a knob on top here, which I'm not going to undo, but it looks like you can loosen this and then you can adjust where this falls versus where the dial on the other side indicates. I left it just the way it is. I don't want to mess with that. I don't have a strobe disc. There's actually a thing you put around the actual spindle in there, and I think you need a strobe light, or there's some way of doing it to time the speed of this, and then you can adjust where this sits. I'm not really going to get into that. This is one of those things that you can hear if it's running too slow, so you'll just adjust it. Now we're going to draw our attention to the old tone arm here, where we're going to remove this little catch piece and use it on the one I'm rebuilding here, because it's missing, and that's going to engage that automatic brake, which there isn't a spring for, so it's kind of a moot point, but I do want to make sure that that's there anyway. So you can see actually it's greasy, of course. So I'll go ahead and just clean that up real quick before I take it off. And here are those parts after a degreasing, a light sanding, followed by a polishing, and they came out pretty darn good. Now this is the original piece that was on the tone arm, and all I had was this stud part, and then I realized that this stud actually screws in here. This is some kind of an adjustable piece, so you can see you can actually adjust how far down that comes. So I will have to make that adjustment once I get this into position. But when I unscrewed this initially, I thought this was all one piece, and then as I started cleaning it, it came apart separately, and then I realized, oh, they are separate pieces. So that's just how crudded over that was. But it's almost like brand new now. And it was actually just easier to remove the whole tone arm from the phonograph to install this piece than it was to try to do it upside down, basically, get the screwdriver in. Was fiddling with this for a little while. I said, you know, there's only 3 screws holding this whole thing in, it'd just be easier. Plus, since I have this out, I can inspect everything. Now, you know, this is one of those things, this is all the visible side of it. Do you leave the natural patina that's on this aged look, or do you scrub this all off and polish it and make it look like new again? I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave it just the way it is. This is not my phonograph. If it was, I probably would do that. But then again, you know, when you start getting into all that, how far do you go? You know, do you actually go ahead and strip down the cabinet and refinish it that way too? And you know, I'm just going to leave all this. The sound reproducer looks like it's in pretty good shape. It's not brand new, but it's in good shape. There's no obvious like punctures. Yeah, the little rubber seal around here isn't in best shape, but when you look at the donor one over here, you can see how this is all like chowdered up over here. And that's definitely no good. You can see it's like weeble wobbling over here. So that one's definitely not in the best of shape. But this one is. And by the way, in case you were wondering how this actually works, this is a good time to show you. The needle gets installed here. Essentially, the only thing you're doing is you're causing that needle to vibrate this sound producer. And actually, I'm going to put this close to the mic. All you're doing, this is all hollow tubes, you're just causing this diaphragm here to vibrate, which is causing the air in here to vibrate, and it just comes out here, and then this attaches to the bottom of the horn, and it just amplifies outwards. Very simple idea. Part of me wants to take the old parts and mount a little tiny speaker in here and make a modern, like an MP3 modern phonograph, you know, where it looks like it's still doing everything, but it's not. But I'm probably not going to do that. But all these other pieces here, I may put a little bit of that oil in here and in here and up in here, just to keep this moving freely. Maybe some in here too. Haven't decided that yet. I mean, that is what that light gear oil is for, but we'll see. I mean, this moves freely enough, and that's the important part. And up here, this all moves freely enough, so it's not too bad. But I do want to go ahead and get this all tidied up. So let me just look this over, make sure everything's good with it. We'll get this mounted back, and then the last thing is just to put the platter back in. It turns out the reproducer here, it just keys in. So when it goes in, it just locks into position. That's all that really does. Now we can finally take a look at the final job here. This is your sound horn. You can see where it comes up to here, so the sound amplifies down through this bend and then out. This part is all wood. In fact, I'll back the camera up just a touch here and show you the doors in the front. And this is where the sound comes out, and then obviously your doors act as a volume control where you can make it louder or not. And these are all individual little baffles. It's the best way to describe it, which allows the sound to come out. I also mentioned way back in probably part one of this, yeah, the first video, that one of the knobs was missing. I don't remember which one, but I found that knob inside the cabinet here, so that was a bit of a win. So now I'm going to go ahead, I'm just going to replace the tone arm, which is just simply a matter of putting this into place like this and screwing that in. I got the screws up here. They're just long flathead screws as always. And then we're just going to drop that motor into place. Now the best way I could see to put the motor in is just angle it in this way. It's kind of heavy on the one side because the springs, but that's just how it's going to go the easiest way. What makes this thing heavy is, well, first of all, this is real wood. This isn't like particle board or anything like that, and you can see it's pretty thick. The other thing, that sound horn is cast iron. I'm assuming it weighs a ton, because I can tell from the one that's just sitting loose in my room here, and then obviously all the metal in that motor. When you get it all together, this makes this thing quite cumbersome. You can move it around pretty easily, just sliding it, but to actually pick it up and put it into a van or anything like that, it is quite heavy. And that lowered it into place really easily. You can actually see there's these knobs up here. You can use this to pull it out. One of the knobs is missing, but that's okay because we still have one at the top here, so you can just pull this up and then, you know, get your fingers underneath it and lift it out. And you can see how I pull it out. It just went in like that to clear that tone arm. Simple. I'll also go ahead, I'll put the 4 screws in here in just a moment, but we can take a look at that automatic brake. You can see how that little bracket up here just clears this, so we will have to move that down a little bit to engage that. Now what's supposed to happen up here is you're supposed to set this to where you want the thing to stop, and then when the tone arm gets to it and hits it, it won't go any further, and it's supposed to actually engage the little brake over here. But Without that spring, we can't really verify that that works or not, but that's okay. It's not an important feature, so we'll just leave that swivel out of the way. As I mentioned many times, this was actually spun around completely the other direction, and it sat underneath the platter here. But we'll set that the right way. I'm going to lower the platter down and split into place. It just sits in the spot here, and that's going to be it. The last thing I did was just put a drop of the bearing oil onto the face of that leather pad there, and then I put some of the light oil on this little hub here so this spins nicely, so you can gauge the brake pretty well. And then on the actual platter, you'll see that inside here are these little cutouts, and there's this key over here, so when you put that on, you do want to make sure that those engage. That is the important part. There it goes. It'll drop right into place. And that is it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put the other screws in the corner just to get this held into position. I'm going to attach the crank on the side. We're going to give it a couple good cranks. We're going to test this out. And I'm probably going to call this video quits. What I will do is in a separate video, I'm going to play a record that I have here, and the only reason why I'm going to do that in a separate video is because I don't want this video taken down due to a possible copyright infringement. I figured if I have another video with just the, the sound of that record in there, if it gets taken down, so what? At least we'll get to see this in operation with the crank and everything going at once. As you can see, the crank is in. This just gets installed in and then screwed into position. It's counterclockwise to remove it, clockwise to install it, and then also crank it. So we can actually hear this thing is going to start cranking up now. That platter will start moving. Let me actually engage the brake. So we can give this a couple good cranks. You don't want to over tighten it. The idea of cranking this up and letting it wind out and doing this a few times is just going to set those springs into position. And here we go. And of course, I just went ahead and popped a record on here real quick, tested it out, and found that the sound is actually very distorted. So then I decided to play around and say, what's making the sound distorted? Let's trace the thing out from the needle all the way through. Well, I know all the rest of this is nice and tight, so it has to be the reproducer. So if you go back to the one that I had in my parts box over here, I mentioned that there was a rubber disc that was deteriorated. So here's the producer and here is the disc. And you can see, yeah, it's definitely shot. In fact, it stinks like that old rubber. So I said, you know what, let me take this apart, pop it off the old tone arm, and I'll take this sound reproducer off and I'll replace them. So now we have the original sound reproducer here with the replacement and the original rubber. And when I reconnected this and tested it out, it was like a night and day difference, literally. This sounds a lot tighter. You don't have that distortion and that rattling and whatnot. So with that, I want to thank you guys for watching this video. If you're not already a subscriber, I'm going to have a link in the corner up at the top over here to subscribe. I'll also have some videos down the corner you can check out. And go check out the video of this thing in operation. Thank you guys. See you next video.